The financial house of Merdle. Edmund Sparkler's stepfather. Ends with Merdle's suicide. The collapse of his bank and investment businesses takes with it the savings of the Dorrits. The firm of Doyce and Clennam. Arthur Clennam. And Panks. Panks feels enormous guilt for persuading Clennam that the financial man of the hour, Merdle, was an investment, not speculation as Clennam judges. Ashamed and unable to pay the business debts, Clennam is now imprisoned in the Marshalsea, where he becomes ill. When little Dorrit arrives in London, she slowly nurses him back to health. Cavaletto tracks down Blandois at the request of Arthur, and brings him to Arthur at the Marshalsea. The truth of Mrs. Clennam's past is revealed by Blandois and confirmed by Jeremiah when both are with Mrs. Clennam at her house on the appointed day 1 week after the meeting in the Marshalsea. Her marriage was arranged by her parents and his uncle. Though Clennam's uncle Gilbert knew his nephew had already married, Mrs. Clennam had insisted on bringing up little Arthur and denying his biological mother, his father's first wife, the right to see him. Mrs. Clennam feels this is her right to punish others. Under the guise of her religion, she was hurt and used her power to hurt others. Arthur's biological mother died about the same time as Arthur went off to China. In her younger life, she joined a house of artistic people in London. Mr. Clennam's wealthy uncle Gilbert, stung by remorse, had left a bequest to Arthur's biological mother and to the youngest daughter of her patron. Or if no daughter, the youngest child of his brother. While Arthur was away in China with his father, the patron was Frederick Dorrit, the kind musician who had taught and befriended Arthur's biological mother. And the beneficiary is his niece, Amy Dorrit. After prodding Mrs. Clennam to tell the truth, which she refuses to do, Jeremiah gave the papers with this codicil to the uncle's will to his twin brother. The night that Arthur arrived home, while telling Mrs. Clennam that he had burned the papers on the next day, Blandois left a copy of the papers he obtained from Jeremiah's brother at the Marshalsea for little Dorrit. Uddharan Chenne. Mrs. Clennam fails to tell little Dorrit of her inheritance or give it to her, though she hires her for seamstress work. And she fails to tell Arthur about his biological mother, though Arthur had sensed that his father had some past burden on his mind even as he died. Unwilling to yield to blackmail by Blandois and with some remorse, the rigid woman rises from her chair and totters out of her house to reveal the secrets to little Dorrit at the Marshalsea. Mrs. Clennam begs her forgiveness, which the kind-hearted girl freely grants. Returning to home, Mrs. Clennam falls in the street, never to recover the use of her speech or limbs, as the house of Clennam literally collapses before her eyes, killing Blandois. Affery was outdoors seeking her mistress, and Jeremiah had escaped London before the collapse with as much money as he could find. Rather than hurt him, little Dorrit chooses not to reveal the will that was meant to benefit her to Arthur, but will tell him about his parents after his mother dies. Mr. Meagles seeks the original papers, stopping in France to ask Miss Wade. She has them but denies it. Tatty Coram, who has suffered under Miss Wade's sadistic temperament, follows Meagles back to London with the papers and presents them to him. He gives them to little Dorrit. When Arthur is well and they are about to marry, little Dorrit asks him to burn the papers. Mr. Meagles then seeks out Arthur's business partner Daniel Doyce from abroad. Doyce returns a wealthy and successful man, who arranges to clear all debts for Arthur's release. Arthur is released from the prison with his fortunes revived, his position secure with Doyce, and his health restored. Arthur and little Dorrit marry.